We know quarterback will be a priority to upgrade for the Falcons this offseason, but what will be their next biggest priority? Will it be wide receiver or the pass rush?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. And so, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black or Mr. Drew or Mr. AKA. And special shout out to the everydayers and all of you that make this illustrious podcast your first listen. And if you want to follow in their footsteps, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I'll apologize up front. I am still dealing with COVID, or at least the fallout of COVID, so I will be having some cough drops in my mouth throughout today's episode, so hopefully it doesn't mess up the audio too much. It's not too distracting for you guys, but this is probably going to be a thing that I'm going to be dealing with for several more days, just because like I already have upper respiratory issues, and so this is not helping. So it's going to probably take me longer to recover than your average person does from that. But today's episode is not the All 22 review that you normally get, because the All 22 review, similar to last week with Christmas and this week with New Year's Eve, was delayed in dropping. So I wasn't able to watch it on Tuesday morning like I normally can. It did drop late Tuesday afternoon, basically right before I started recording this. And so the minute I'm done recording this, I will dive into that, and that will drop for you guys hopefully Wednesday around lunchtime on YouTube. And then, yeah, same thing for your audio platforms. But instead, we're going to do a mailbag. You know me. I love my mailbags when I got nothing else to talk about. And, you know, I'm basically 2 steps away from checking out from the season. So I don't really have a whole lot to say that it hasn't already been said 1,000 times. And so we have one question sent in by a Locked On Falcons insider. Shout out to you, Richie. You will get a whole episode devoted to answering this one question. The stars align for you. I don't promise that for the Locked On Falcons insights on a regular basis. You guys do get priority when it comes to these mailbags, but Richie, you will have an entire episode devoted to you. So we'll talk about wide receiver and edge rusher, and why, to me, those are the 2 biggest positions of priority to upgrade this offseason, and we'll talk both rather than me trying to nail down one. But without further ado, let's get into Richie's question, which is, besides the quarterback and head coach, what would you say is the next most important position the Falcons need to address in the offseason? Who are some of the options available to us at that position via free agency and the draft? And that, of course, again, comes from Richie. And so my answer to this question, Richie, is wide receiver and edge. And depending on the day kind of determines which one I feel, because I think it really kind of just depends on what do you think is going to be the key to beating teams like Kansas City and Dallas and Philadelphia, you know, next year. Is it going to be outscoring those offenses, getting into shootouts with those offenses and winning shootouts? Or is it going to be playing great defense and shutting down those offenses and hoping to win a lower scoring game? And, you know, what your answer to that, depends, right? But, you know, I think this team needs to get more explosive at the wide receiver position. And they also need to improve their pass rush as well, right? They're hopefully we'll get to 40 sacks this year, on Sunday, and that will be modest improvement. But, you know, it doesn't feel like a 40 sack season because a lot of those sacks came in a handful of games, right? They were able to rack up sacks in a handful of games. And for most of this season, especially the first half of the season, you know, they were, getting like 1 or 2 sacks and whatnot. And so, yeah. So the other position that I think you could make a case for, I wouldn't put it above wide receiver edge, is cornerback. And the reason why I wouldn't make a case, because I think you have a good number 2 corner already on your roster in Jeff Okudah, but the Falcons don't seem to agree with that assessment. And so, we're getting Clark Phillips, and we'll see how the Falcons address that issue. I'm not necessarily, thinking that, they need to make a priority of upgrading the cornerback position this offseason, just because I'm not one of those folks that really truly believes that, having to lock down, shut down corners, not to say it's not valuable, but I don't think that's a way to sort of the foundation of building your defense, right? Just because coverage is not necessarily something that is sustainable year to year, right? That's one of the things that we talked about this years ago on the podcast, where PFF did a study, which is what's more important, coverage or pass rush. And coverage was more impactful than pass rush, but pass rush is more consistent year to year. And so coverage is more like, up and down year to year, and pass rush is just kind of steady. And so from a team building philosophy, I get why you would go either way, but for me, I tend to lean towards pass rush. And for that reason, so to me, getting another bookend next to AJ Terrell, all that to say, is not necessarily going to be as big a priority to me as upgrading the pass rush. But that being said, let's talk more about edge rusher coming up in today's episode, and we'll break down, to answer your question, Richie, sort of some of the top free agents and some of the top draft prospects, at least sitting here today in early January, on who could potentially be realistic targets for the Atlanta Falcons. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets to all the sports, comedy, music, and theater near you. They have killer last-minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guaranteed. The killer last-minute deals mean you can buy tickets right up to the start of the event and even after. Those all-in prices mean you're not going to get hit with hidden fees. Views from your seat means you can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And their best price guarantee means if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, they'll credit you 110% the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's terms apply. Again, create an account, and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So let's talk edge rusher, right? And, I think most people would generally agree that the Falcons need a quote unquote alpha edge rusher. And I don't know if the Falcons are going to be able to find an alpha edge rusher this offseason. We'll see, right? There are some players that are kind of borderline, right? And when we talk free agency, we're going to be basing our opinion heavily off of the recently released PFF top 100 free agent rankings. And our boy, Brad Spielberger, friend of the show, did some projections on what contracts certain guys will get, including certain guys that he expects to get tagged. And so we're going to assume some of those tag players are not going to be available. And for the edge rush class, that assumes Josh Allen of the Jaguars and Brian Burns of the Panthers are going to get tagged, which would leave, some of the top edge rushers. And we're also operating under the assumption, which is maybe not a safe assumption, that Ryan Nielsen and Arthur Smith are going to be back next year. So we're going to be tailoring our targets list to what we know those guys will be. Obviously, if the Falcons have brand new coaching staff, a week from, or obviously it's not going to be a week from today, but, if they're looking for a brand new coaching staff, then all this goes out the window. So basically, it's why we'll talk about it now. And we'll probably wind up, if we need to, revisiting this, come February and whatnot. So probably your top option in free agency is going to be Danielle Hunter, right? Just because, like, in terms of like size that Ryan Nielsen likes, right? So like a player like Bryce Huff or Carl Lawson or Josh Uche is not going to be someone that the Falcons are going to be particularly interested in free agency this offseason, but someone who can have that size. Like basically the perfect Ryan Nielsen defensive end is like 6'5", 270, 35-inch arms, may not be the bendiest guy, but can set the edge, bull rush, all that sort of stuff. Danielle Hunter is probably the top option. Then you have Chase Young, right? You could throw Jonathan Grenard in there. Jadeveon Clowney, Zadarius Smith, Leonard Floyd, probably not as bulky as Ryan Nielsen likes, but he does a lot of Ryan Nielsen things. And then Durance Armstrong probably would be, and Danico Autry also would round out that list. And so all of those guys make sense in the Ryan Nielsen defense. Hunter and Young are probably going to be the most expensive ones, although Brad Spielberger is projecting Jonathan Grenard to actually get more per annual. For Jonathan Grenard, he's going to get 3 years, $48 million than what I think Chase Young is getting. So that'll be interesting, and more than what Bryce Huff is getting as well. So, Hunter has connections to the coaching staff with Jerry Gray from Minnesota. Clowney was a player. We talked about this last offseason. Clowney was a player that the Saints pursued when Nielsen was there. They didn't sign him. Zadarius Smith obviously has connections with Dean Pease from his days in Baltimore. Danico Autry I don't think Danico Autry overlapped with Arthur Smith in Tennessee, but Tennessee's defense is very similar to how the Falcons play. So Autry makes a ton of sense. It is a good scheme fit. And Durance Armstrong, the Falcons, I can't remember what his role is this year. I think he's defensive line guy. Mario Jebaril was part of, I don't know if he was his position coach at Kansas. No, I think he was an offensive line coach when Durance Armstrong was at Kansas years ago. So those are some players that make sense for the Falcons if they want to go free agent and try to get the best pass rusher. Of course, Marcus Davenport's also on the market, but not in the PFF top 100 rankings. So we'll see. From what I understand, the Falcons tried to sign Davenport this past offseason. He chose Minnesota, and obviously he's had an injury-plagued season there, but they could get another bite at that apple. And so basically it's like Danielle Hunter. And the challenge with free agency is going to be, right, like Danielle Hunter's projected contract is going to be 3 years, $65 million. So over $20 million a year. Do the Falcons want to pay that type of price? That's the conversation we had in June about Danielle Hunter. That's the conversation we had in October about Danielle Hunter. Would the Falcons want to pay any player in free agency more than what they're paying Jesse Bates, which is $16 million a year, more than what they're paying Grady Jarrett, which is $16.5 million a year? I'm skeptical of that. I've been skeptical of that for the past year, which is part of the reason why I was skeptical that the Falcons would make one of these midseason trades for one of these edge rushers like a Montez Sweat. And the price, Montez Sweat signed a $25 million, basically a $25 million contract. And I was like, I don't think the Falcons will pay him that type of money, which is why they lowballed, I guess you could say, that trade offer, allegedly, reportedly. So I don't know. So I could see the Falcons waiting to the draft instead, rather than paying this premium, for one of these free agents like a Danielle Hunter. And when you look at the draft, and we're going to operate under the assumption that the Falcons are going to wind up with a top 10 pick, because I'm not feeling great about the Falcons beating the Saints this weekend. I want them to, but they always lose these types of games. So like, I'm not going into that game with high expectations. Spoiler alert for the crossover. But the top edge rushers that are probably being projected to go potentially in the top 10, where the Falcons should be picking: Dallas Turner of Alabama, Latu of UCLA, Jared Verse of Florida State. I think I've heard things about Latu. Latu to me is my favorite guy of that group, but he has some weird injury history. Jared Verse, I'm not as high on Verse as other people were. Like when people were projecting him as a top 10 pick last year, I didn't see that. I watched him early this season. I was like, yeah, he's not the guy that people have been hyping him up to be. But from what I understand, he got better as the season wore on. So I haven't watched later Jared Verse this past fall. So I'll do that before I make my final judgment. But my general impression of Jared Verse is he's closer to Jermaine Johnson than he is like a typical top 10 edge rusher. So we'll see if that opinion changes in the coming months. So I wouldn't necessarily love him as a top 10 pick. Turner's probably going to be the consensus guy because he doesn't have the injury concerns that Latu has, and he probably has the length, bend, and some people question Latu's athleticism. I think he's going to test better than people think, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. So I don't know if the Falcons going to pull the trigger on any one of those guys at the top of the draft. Maybe Dallas Turner, especially if he can bulk up a little bit. I know he's pushing 250, I think. Ryan Nielsen's going to want him to put another 10 pounds on. So we'll see about that. But I think more the style of edges that the Falcons might be looking for, a JT Tuimoloau of Ohio State, Braylon Trice of Washington, probably late first, early second round sort of player. So I could see the Falcons passing on a edge in round one and pulling the trigger on that guy in round two. Braylon Trice to me sort of feels like a good replacement for Bud Dupree. He's he feels very much like a Ryan Nielsen type of edge, right? 6'5", 270-ish. I don't know what his length is, but kind of just a bruiser, a power guy. And from what I saw in that playoff game against Texas, they were lining him up all over the place and he was winning all over the place. So certainly a guy that, has a chance to elevate his stock with these playoff games with one more left to go. So we'll see if by the end of that, people are talking about him as a first round pick as opposed to maybe a day two sort of pick. So that's kind of the general vibe. I think there will be options for the Falcons to upgrade their pass rush. I don't know if there's going to be a single guy that you're going to sit there and be like, boom, he solved the Falcons pass rush problem. Like he's the final piece of the puzzle or whatever. Danielle Hunter's probably the closest example of that. Obviously, Chase Young is another big name type of dude that has the talent to be that guy, but hasn't consistently shown it. Although you imagine Ryan Nielsen would love to get his hands on a player like Chase Young to kind of mold him a little bit, but we'll see how that all plays out. So we'll wrap up today's episode by having the same conversation about the potential wide receivers available. The difference being the free agent pool is a little less in the wide receiver position, and the draft stock is much deeper at that spot. But we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. And before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel. First of its kind. Check it out if you want to get all the lowdown across not only the biggest stories in the NFL, but across all the leagues, as well as get that local expertise. Now, the NFL season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like same game parlays and finding bets in the new Explore tab. And I love a parlay, right? Bet a little, win a lot. And FanDuel's made it easy because they have a parlay hub. And you can find some popular parlays that other people are trying. And, you can innovate and be an icon yourself by finding more at FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. So wrapping up today's episode, continuing our conversation, answering Richie's question about what's the next biggest position. We talked about edge rusher. We talked about now let's talk about wide receiver. And, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation this offseason because I think wide receiver is not going to get as much love as people think because the Falcons already have a number one. They already have Kyle Pitts. They don't need a wide receiver. I mean, we've had off and on, we've had this conversation for like the last 2 or so off seasons. 2 years ago when we drafted Drake London, it was like, we don't need a wide receiver, right? We have Kyle Pitts and whoever else we I don't know. But I don't know. It feels like to me, this wide receiver conversation has been a long time coming because I don't know if you guys remember this, but I feel like there was a podcast like back in March of 2022 that was talking about the Falcons needing to upgrade their wide receiver position. And then they went out and signed Mac Hollins. And that podcast was like, I don't think this is solving the Falcons wide receiver position. And people for like the next 6 months were like, no, Mac Hollins is going to be a difference maker in Atlanta. And then he's now relegated to being the fifth receiver and basically playing special teams and blocking whenever he gets on the field on offense. And I'm just like, man, whoever was talking about that back in March of last year, that like Mac Hollins is not going to solve the Falcons' number 2 wide receiver woes. they should give that guy a raise. Like I think he's doing a great job. So let me know what podcast that was. I just can't remember what it was, but let's say it was like something on Falcons. I can't remember. Anyway, but let let's talk about some of the free agents available. And again, looking at PFF's top 100 rankings, they do have T. Higgins, Michael Pittman, and Calvin Ridley all projected to be tagged. I know some of your questions is going to be, what does a franchise tag do for the Falcons draft pick? I don't know, guys. Like, I'm not invested in whether or not the Falcons get a second. What will be second, third, fourth, whatever. Don't care. I know you guys really care because you got to get your mock draft simulators going. For me, I just look at that pick and I'm just like, that could be the most consequential pick in Falcons history, or it could be one of the most inconsequential picks in Falcons history. We'll find out. It'll more than likely just be a sort of complimentary starter that won't really impact this team until like 2026. So I'm not super invested in, whether that's a second or third or fourth, that's just me though. But, you guys do you. But so that leaves Mike Evans as the top sort of free agent that's expected to hit the market, followed by Marquise Brown. To me, the two guys that stand out, because when I look at what I think the Falcons need to target at wide receiver, again, assuming that Arthur Smith is back, like they need a number two that can sort of stretch defenses. That's what they need, right? That's what they tried to acquire with Van Jefferson, and they need to go right back to that well and find someone that can do similar things that Van Jefferson can do, but actually catch the football, which I don't think it's Van Jefferson. Like sometimes guys miss him, and sometimes he just drops passes. But so the two guys that kind of stand out to me and that can fit that mold are Darnell Mooney of the Bears and Gabe Davis of the Bills. Those are the sort of the two primary guys. But other wide receivers that PFF has in their top 100 rankings: Odell Beckham Jr., Tyler Boyd, Curtis Samuel, Kendrick Bourne. So Mooney and Davis are kind of the two. If the Falcons want to spend money, those would be the two guys. Neither one of those guys are the most consistent players. We've seen very high level play from both of those guys, but the story of their first 4 years in the NFL has been mostly inconsistency. If you ask Bears and probably Bills fans, they would probably have generally disappointing opinions of those guys. And so signing those guys, you're basically betting, okay, well, we'll get them right. And it's like, the Darnell Mooney argument to me is a much easier argument to make than the Gabe Davis, because it's like, the Bills have had a top 5 offense for like 3 years in a row. And so if Gabe Davis is limited in that offense, then he's probably certainly going to be limited in the Falcons offense, but we'll see. But wide receiver is a position that is very deep in this draft. There may be as many as a half dozen wide receivers taken in round 1 this year. And with the Falcons picking in the top 10, there are 3 wide receivers that are kind of the consensus that it seems like right now that'll probably be picked in that top 10, top 5, top 10 range. Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State. He's projected to be the first non-quarterback off the board. We'll see if one of these left tackles like Joe Alt of Notre Dame and Olu Fashanu of Penn State can push him in that regard. But right after Marvin Harrison goes, the consolation prize is going to be Malik Nabers of LSU. And it's not going to shock me that at some point in the next 3 or so months that you're going to hear some people being like, Malik Nabers is actually wide receiver 1 over Marvin Harrison. That wouldn't shock me at all. Nabers is a really good player. And frankly, kind of to me, the ideal fit for the Falcons at that wide receiver position, that if they're looking for a guy that can just be a dynamic, like to me, a player that Nabers reminds me of, someone asked me earlier this season who they compare Nabers to, and I said DJ Moore. And I bring that back up because you guys just saw what DJ Moore did to this defense. And like Nabers is a really good vertical stretch receiver and also dynamic with the ball in his hands. And he's the type of guy that Arthur Smith can run those 12-yard digs to, hit him in stride over the middle, and he can turn those into big gains. He did that routinely at LSU. And it's funny because I know some people watch LSU to watch their wide receivers and get enamored with Jaden Daniels, and I watch LSU to watch Jaden Daniels and get enamored with the wide receivers. But those are the kind of those are the top two. Rome Odunze of Washington is kind of the consensus other third guy. I like Odunze. To me, he's like a slightly faster version of Drake London. Bruce Feldman in his freaks list broke down that said Odunze can run a 4.3. I don't see that type of speed from him, but like upper 4.4s, like I see that. So I don't know if Odunze is the dynamic threat that I want, but I think he's probably a more dynamic threat than Drake London is, but is more of that kind of possession type of receiver. Now, once you get past those three wide receivers, I think that's when you get in your pick your flavor. Who's going to be your wide receiver 4, 5, etc. is going to be depend on what you want, right? Keon Coleman of Florida State, Xavier Worthy of Texas, Brian Thomas of LSU, Adonai Mitchell of Texas, Emeka Ibuka of Ohio State probably will be sort of generally the next 5 in people's rankings after those the top 3 guys. Personally, I'm a Brian Thomas fan of LSU because I feel like he's that vertical threat that you want that can really take the top off and also has the size that we know Arthur Smith covets. So to me, I'm leaning towards him as that a 4th guy on my sort of personal rankings, or at least I might have him over Odunze. We'll see. We'll see how it all goes. But Xavier Worthy's another speed threat. He's a smaller guy, but he can definitely stretch defenses. Mitchell is also a big fast guy. Buka's not a big fast guy, but he's quick. I think he's more quick than he is speed guy. And Keon Coleman's big, and can get in wind jump balls, but the Falcons have already enough of those guys, the contested catch guys. That's going to be the big concern about Keon Coleman. And so Coleman's going to be one of those players that I don't know if I think he's currently being projected by some people in the top 10, top 15-ish. I could see him sliding on the board because he's not a great separator. He's just kind of more of a jump ball guy. And those guys typically don't get drafted that highly. Excuse me. So we'll kind of see at the wide receiver position, but I think those are kind of the 2 positions, wide receiver and edge, that I would look at as, 2A and 2B with the Falcons. And as I said at the top, depending on what you think is the key to beating better football teams that the Falcons are going to face next year, do you want to slow down those offenses or do you want to try to outscore those offenses? And probably how you feel about that, a lot of that kind of depends on who the quarterback is, right? If Falcons are drafting a quarterback in the top 10 or wherever, maybe you want to invest your free agent dollars in an edge. I don't know. Again, it's a lot of moving parts. So I'm trying to sit here and be like, well, you do this. No, but it's like, I don't know. You could run different permutations as much as you want. So yeah, it's just, I think depending on who your quarterback is, basically will determine whether or not you feel like you can outscore those teams if we can just get a little bit more explosive, I guess is what I was getting at. And so that's going to be the sort of question that will have to be answered. But I feel like those are kind of the big 3, personnel issues that you're going to have to deal with. Obviously, the big question about is like, who's going to be running the show? Is it going to be Arthur Smith or is it going to be somebody else? So we'll see. I don't, for the record, I don't see Terry Fontenot getting axed, but we'll just sort of have to see about that just because general managers tend to have a longer leash. We talked about this before, just because the way that you judge general man, there's no immediate way to judge general managers like there is with coaches with wins and losses, right? General manager, you're judging them off of drafts, but it takes 3+ years for you to be able to judge a draft. So it's like, you got to just kind of wait, but we'll see how that all plays out, guys. That's going to do it for us here. We'll be back tomorrow with an all 22 review as well as a crossover Thursday. Make sure you continue to make us your first listen. We're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every